I was never the new kid, and in hindsight, I'm grateful for that. In fact, I was the exact opposite. I felt like everyone knew me, often a little too well. I started kindergarten and graduated from high school with most of the same kids. I knew them and their siblings and their parents, and they all knew me. I went to junior high in the same building that my grandpa attended high school, in a town where both sets of my grandparents and most of my parents' siblings and their families all lived. I grew up around family and friends, neighbors and acquaintances, even classmates of my parents and grandparents. People knew us. They knew where we lived. They even recognized our vehicles. They would wave at us passing on the road, regardless of who was driving. Living in a small town where it felt like everyone knew generations of my family, we joked that you didn't need to use your blinker when you were driving somewhere because everybody already knew where you were going, literally and figuratively. But they didn't know where I was going. Eventually, when I had the opportunity, I was going to be the new kid, someone unknown. My great-grandparents, my grandparents, my parents, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, and my brothers, they were all part of my foundation. I was known well at school because my older brother had been there a few years before, and my cousins before him. We went to the same church that my grandparents attended. We attended annual rituals that continually reinforced how well we were known by others. We saw the neighbors at fiesta days in May, at county fair in August, and at snowdown in January. At the feed store, at the grocery store, at the hardware store, at the post office. It was rare to go somewhere in our small town and not see multiple familiar faces. Even when I studied abroad in high school, I went with other students and teachers from our school. While I was halfway around the world in very unfamiliar surroundings in Western Europe, I was surrounded by people who knew me. So I felt like I had a pretty big comfort zone, and I rarely ventured outside of it. And I have to say, overall, it was nice to be known. It was nice to have that long history in one place and a very firm foundation from which I could set out in the world. It was nice to feel rooted, to feel a sense of belonging that stretched back generations and covered a large geographical area. I'm grateful for my strong foundation, for that sense of belonging, that big comfort zone. It gave me the confidence to explore, to try new things, to go new places that I might not otherwise have been willing to do. By the time I graduated from high school, I was ready to get out of town, to spread my wings, to get out of my comfort zone and shed my skin. While the solid foundation was great, I was ready for some anonymity. I wanted to just be me instead of being a small part of a big legacy. I wanted to be Brian instead of a Fassett, or one of the twins, or from the Mesa. I wanted the chance to reinvent myself, even though I didn't yet know who I might become. That's one of the benefits of being the new kid. You get to decide who you are and who you want to be, instead of everyone around you deciding that for you. I wanted to be that new kid, to be unknown. I wanted to get out of the shade of my past and stand in the sun, free to create a new future and an identity just my own. I wanted the chance to start fresh and invent myself, so that's just what I did. I found the farthest university from home where I could still pay in-state tuition. But even there, it felt a little too familiar. So I set my sights on further destinations. I sailed around the world on a semester at sea. I switched to a different university and changed majors to international affairs. I lived in Latin America and learned Spanish, and ultimately discovered that I could be whoever I wanted to be. I could reinvent myself. So I did it again. I moved across the country, and then I moved back overseas to serve in the Peace Corps, where I learned yet another language. Each time I learned a new language and immersed myself in a new culture, it felt like putting on a new skin. I felt uniquely me. I found Brian. When I came back, I explored jobs in a variety of industries. I tried new hobbies, and in doing so, I learned a lot about myself, about what I believe and like and want, independent of everyone else. Having had the chance to be the new kid multiple times at my own choosing, I got to discover who I am. And for that, I'm eternally grateful.
Hi, I'm Stephani. I'm new here. I'm often new, as it happens. I've had a lot of practice at it. When I was a child, my family moved all the time, often more than once per year. I went to 4 different schools in the first grade alone, 3 in the second grade. 5th grade was the first year that I attended one school for the whole year, but not the last time we moved. Some of those moves were merely across town, with school and church remaining the same, and sometimes they were just 30 minutes up the road, still in the same county even, but it may as well have been the moon in terms of the impact on our day-to-day life and relationships. And on a few occasions, we moved even further away, Louisiana, Arizona, New York State, where there were even bigger cultural differences. The night before we loaded up my belongings to drive me from our home in New York to my college dorm in Washington, D.C. for the first time, my mother and I tallied up the number of places that I had lived so far. 26 homes in 20 years. If you're wondering if that was traumatic, well, sure, kind of. In some ways, of course. But my mother is warm and joyful and compassionate, and she always made me feel cherished and heard. She was my constant. And there were also treasures to be found in the experience of being the new kid. Things that I'm grateful for as an adult. We lived primarily along the Gulf Coast of Texas, Louisiana, which, as it happens, is home to a very diverse population. So making new friends often included reaching across racial and cultural divides, something that I didn't find difficult, perhaps precisely because of my experience of being the new kid. I was just always thrilled to have found a friend, even if their mother's cooking was strange. Looking back, I think this was one of the blessings of my itinerant upbringing. I learned early that normal is contextual. It can change dramatically even when you only move 37 miles up the road. And so by extension, differences in language and culture became easier to take in stride. I was always different, always an outsider, and I was always hoping for a friend, and we could be outsiders together. One of the other treasures of being new was that I was free to take risks socially. I had a kind of bird's eye view of the community I was entering. Often in a new place, I would see that someone was unpopular or ostracized for no clear reason that I could perceive. When I would ask why, the explanation was usually some kind of prejudice, either of the dominant cultural norms or something of a more personal nature. For instance, his father is a drug lord. No, he was a political refugee from Honduras. Or he eats crayons. What, now? No, back in the second grade. Which seems ridiculous to me since we were now in the 8th grade and he was, really cute. Or all she ever wants to do is read books. Awesome, me too. I definitely envied the kids like Brian, who from the outside always seemed to have an innate sense of belonging, a confident understanding of their world and their place in it. And yet, I also felt sorry for them because none of those kids, neither the popular ones nor the outcasts, had been allowed to grow out of their old stories and into their new stories. The fierce childhood pressure to conform didn't always allow for growing up, much less an appreciation of cultural differences. This was another blessing of the constant moving. My own social history of gaffes and social affiliations was always an enigma. I could reinvent myself over and over. And when I was in elementary school, I sometimes tried really hard to curate that makeover style. It was like some grade school production of Groundhog's Day with me and Bill Murray's role, desperately trying to recreate the circumstances that worked that one time, only to learn that ultimately you can't force it. Sometimes I was ostracized, and sometimes I was welcomed. But either way, I moved often enough to eventually understand, even as a kid, that it wasn't anything I was doing, it wasn't anything I was being that explained it. It was luck. It was some invisible social alchemy that cannot be predicted. Will I be popular? Will I be a pariah? What is the fourth grade equivalent of dressing for success? I came to understand that the only thing I could predict, the only thing that could be constant, was me. If I was open to new experiences, if I was kind to all comers, then at least my own company would be worthwhile to me. And the friends that I would win over with that authenticity and openness, they would be worthwhile too. And if it didn't work out, there was always next time. So far, this story is kind of unusual, but also fairly straightforward. Here's a wrinkle, though. The year that my little brother was born, the year that I turned 6, we bought a house in Freeport, Texas. For the next 8 years, for at least part of every year, I lived in that house and attended that same school just up the street. We might move away for 2 months or 10, but we would always come back. And what I learned was that Heraclitus was right. You cannot step in the same river twice. I often wasn't able to walk right back in and take up the same place in the circle of friends that I had left behind. Sometimes the space had closed up. New alliances had been formed. Friends who had already grieved my loss didn't view me as a safe bet. Or else new developmental stages, we were all growing kids after all, had drawn divisions where there had been none before. And sometimes I didn't fit back into the place I had left behind. I was changed by my time away. My mind and expectations expanded. So the question, where are you from, has often given me vertigo. You may think that once I was an adult, I would be determined to stay put. Like the lyrics of a Nancy Griffith, Tom Paxton song, nail my shoes to the kitchen floor, just lace them up and bar the door. But that isn't what happened. While it's true that my adult years have been relatively stable compared to my childhood, I've started over several times as an adult too. Some of these are due to natural thresholds. When I met my partner, Mark, I knew really early on that he was the one. And as I'm sure is true for many of you, some of the most important rites of passage that marked our relationship were meeting his friends for the first time, meeting his parents for the first time, getting to know my new brother and sister-in-law. A whole new family to adjust to and come to love. 18 years ago, my joyful and exuberant son Kai was born. Children change our lives in many profound ways, not least of which is the new friendships that they bring our way. Forged in playgroups and parks and PTA meetings, I met one of my dearest friends in the nursery at First Unitarian downtown. My daughter Seneca, observant and wry, is 12 years old now. When she was 3, we moved to Germany. I enrolled her in the local preschool, and I'm sure that I was at least as nervous as she was, standing there on the steps of the Montessori Kinderhaus for that first time, wondering how to start a conversation, wondering if anyone spoke English, too timid to try my broken German, but also knowing that it would never get better if I didn't. All of the Germans that I came to count as true friends, I met on those steps, dropping off and picking up our children. As you can tell from that last story, I didn't stay in Washington, D.C. In fact, I ended up moving quite a few more times over the years. And in this, I'm apparently quite normal. It turns out Americans move more often than any people anywhere else in the world, a fact that I'm sure many of you here today can attest to. A 2016 article in The Atlantic, quoting data from the US Census Bureau, found that the average American moves house more than 11 times in their lifetime. 11 new neighborhoods, new commutes, new relationships. In an article exploring the same data set, the website 538 notes that the wealthiest individuals are the most likely to stay put. Wealthy people move about half as often as those that live below the poverty line. They go on to say that, of course, none of these factors can be understood in isolation. We know that older Americans are more likely to be wealthy ones too. And we know that the median net worth of a Black American household is $11,000 a year, compared to $142,000 for a white American household. So poverty and its disproportionate impact on communities that are marginalized by race or other factors displaces many Americans. There are other reasons Americans cite for moving. Changes in relationships, such as marriage, divorce, a growing family, as well as desire for better neighborhoods and schools. But on the whole, most people say they moved for work. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that most Americans will have an average of 12 jobs in their lifetimes. 12 new offices with new coworkers and new workplace cultures to navigate. So between changing jobs and moving to a new home, most Americans will likely experience being the new kid several times over in their lifetime. I too have moved around the US as an adult, from New York to Washington, D.C., from San Francisco to Portland. And sometimes I've moved even further away. Like Brian, I volunteered for the Peace Corps. And by the way, Brian's actually the third returned Peace Corps volunteer that I've met right here at Willamette Falls. And apparently his wife, Kate, is also one, which brings the tally up to 5 so far, if you count me. I bet there are others. We could probably start our own Peace Corps alumni chapter right here. I lived in Mali, in West Africa. My experience of living in Mali was the sort of thing that divides your life into a before and an after. Don't get me wrong, moving from Texas to suburban New York was also quite jarring culturally. But despite all my times of being the new girl, I had never had to stand outside of myself that way and to realize just how much of what I thought was me was actually culturally learned habit. Malians prioritize relationship building in almost every interaction, from visiting neighbors to buying peanut butter in the market to saying hello on the street. When I came back to the United States, I really struggled with the pace of life in America, with what felt like arbitrary, unnecessary deadlines, with the sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle implication that the common courtesy of expressing interest in someone is somehow wasting their valuable time. I also realized that we try hardest to conform when we have some hope of blending. There can be a sense of relief in having absolutely no hope of blending. What if I can't even try? What if I have no choice but to just be myself? There's even a West African proverb for it. No matter how long a log lies in a river, it can never become a crocodile. I was in my 20s when I volunteered for Peace Corps, and I thought that this was a lesson that I had already learned. but it turned out that there were so many more layers to unearth. This particular lesson, I believe, is the work of a lifetime. Thanks to my husband Mark's Navy career, I also had the great good fortune to live in both Italy and, of course, Germany, as I mentioned earlier. We were actually in Germany for 7 years and just returned to Portland in the summer of 2019. In contrast to America, Germans don't move often, and they rarely change jobs. Their friends tend to be people that they have known since kindergarten, a trend that is reinforced by their practice of keeping the same classroom of kids together for years at a time. The kids stay together in the teachers' change rooms. Certain parts of the country are more stable than others. The southwestern state of Baden-Württemberg, where we lived, is generally seen as wealthier and more conventional than some other parts of Germany. I remember shortly after moving there, being at a neighbor's New Year's Eve party, and at some point in the evening it hit me that not only were we the only foreigners at that party, we were the only ones who were not born within 15 miles of the house. Germans can take a long time to warm up to someone new. Those friends that I made at the preschool, in most cases, it took about 2 years for us to go beyond really simple conversations, and that wasn't just about my language skills. My own daughter, Seneca, who was born here but raised there, unwittingly gave a perfectly German response to an offer of friendship one day. When I picked her up from her rock climbing club, she told me that actually the club had been canceled that week and there had been no class after all. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I said. "Was it terribly boring? Were you all alone?" "Nah," she said. "There was another kid there who came over and asked if I wanted to be friends." "Well, that's great," I said. "Well," she said matter-of-factly, "I told him that friends was a bit much, but we could play together and see how it goes." Germans are cautious about friendship, but once you've made a German friend, you're friends for life. In my time there, I realized that I could learn a lot from their example. Being open to friendship doesn't mean having no boundaries. You can be authentic and kind without rushing headlong into confidences that you haven't laid the groundwork for. In his essay, Self-Reliance, Ralph Waldo Emerson says, "I pack my trunk, embrace my friends, embark on the sea, and at last wake up in Naples. And there beside me is the stern fact, the sad self, unrelenting, identical, that I fled from." He argues quite acerbically in that essay and in others that we don't need to leave our homes to live an examined, soulful life. If our lives are unfulfilling, he argues, it's not the fault of the place or the people where we are. It is in ourselves. And I don't think that he was wrong. Escapism can come in many forms. It's true. He wrote those words 180 years ago, and I suspect that modern life is even more escapist than it used to be. The advertising industry in particular tries to tell us that the solution to all our ills lies out there, outside of us, over the next horizon, with this new product or that new experience. But that's a sermon for a different day. At first glance, Emerson seems to bear a grudge against traveling specifically. But he's talking about traveling as a lark, an adventure. He definitely wasn't criticizing refugees or people that have to move their families for work. He was referring to a kind of tourism, a surface encounter with others that's not about cultivating genuine relationship. And you can skate superficially through your lives anywhere, abroad or in the place where you were born. And while it's true that stepping outside of your comfort zone, as both Brian and I have done, can give you some valuable insight, the odds are that any one of us could find places outside of our comfort zone right here in our own communities. We can all grow right where we are if we make space in our lives to truly see people how they are. If we make an effort to understand and love people whose experience and worldview are different from our own. Our lives are full of opportunities to grow, to begin to understand how we are shaped by our own prejudices and perspectives, to begin to cultivate genuine relationship with our neighbors. For instance, here I am today, once again feeling like the new kid. As an intern, I'm here to learn how to become a minister. I'm in seminary, taking classes on everything from theology to pastoral care to church administration. And this is my apprenticeship, where I hope to learn what all that book learning looks like in practice in the real world by people who are already doing it. I'm going to be here for 2 years, and I'm looking forward to getting to know each of you, hearing your stories, and sharing in the life of this beloved community. My nomadic childhood makes for a dramatic story, but all of us have new situations to contend with over the course of our lives. Each of us will find ourselves metaphorically standing with our lunch tray in the school cafeteria, wondering where it is safe to sit. In German, you don't say that you make friends, you say that you find them. What if we were to each be authentically ourselves and then open ourselves to finding friends as they come? Not making them, not trying to anticipate what they're looking for in a friend, or having a checklist of what we want in one, or forcing friendship to bloom without proper care beforehand. But instead, just being authentic and open and kind in each new situation that comes our way. May it be so.